Hello and welcome to BizTalk. I'm Zheng Jufeng, coming to you live in Beijing. As the United States continues to exert pressure on Venezuela, energy and economic issues are once again at the center of global conversation over this geopolitical drama. What's happening goes far beyond one country's future. How is it reshaping global supply chains, market expectations, and international economic order? Today, we're joined by three guests. Professor Xu Yanran, Research Fellow for Center of Latin American Studies at the Renmin University of China. Thanks for joining us, Professor Xu. We have Mr. Gerardo Enrique Martinez Guzman, the founder and editor-in-chief iDocumenta in Guatemala. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Guzman. Thanks for joining us at a very early local time.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, and Professor John Quelch, the American president of Duke Kunshan University. Welcome, Professor Quelch. So let's start our conversation. So to Professor Xu first, how should we understand the recent U.S. military actions towards Venezuela, as you've been studying in Latin American economy and development for a very long time? Is this more about energy or Americans' influence in Latin America?
I think recent U.S. actions toward Venezuela, especially the intervention, capture of the President Nicolas Maduro, and ensuring controls over oil exports, I think it definitely should be understood as primarily driven by strategic energy interests, but it's also closely intertwined with financial leverage rather than purely military objectives. And as we all know, that Venezuela possesses some of the world's largest proven oil reserves, and it's long viewed as a critical energy assets. So this kind of U.S. sanctions and oil embargoes, I think it definitely demonstrates how financial instruments are used to, dampen or sever Venezuela's oil reserves. So it's definitely a form of financial influences closely tied to energy extractions. And also, I think this combination suggests U.S. military measures seeks to neutralize Venezuela's capacity to independently wield its oil revenues. So, and it's also creating spaces for U.S. oil companies to jump in and to reassert influence. So I think the U.S. intervention appears to be, driven primarily by energy security and access, but also financial mechanism could be worked to shape Venezuelans' state revenues.
Right. Professor Xu mentioned oil is at least one of the key strategic goals of the U.S. in its action towards Venezuela. So the U.S. also made it clear it wants to sell Venezuelan oil around the world. And recently, another news happening is that recently the U.S. seized Russian oil tankers. What is the U.S. intention behind these actions?
I think this kind of, actions also, including seizing Venezuelans, linked oil tankers, coordinating the sale of Venezuelans crude. I think there are several goals. Number one is to undermine the financial base of those what the U.S. called adversarial regimes like Maduro's government or anything that linked to Russian and Iran. And this is first one. The second one, I think, is trying to demonstrate U.S. willingness to deploy military and legal tools far beyond its borders. And the third, I think what the U.S. actions want to do is to reassert U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere at the moment of domestic and geopolitical strain. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. To you, Mr. Guzman, because you are in Guatemala, you are in Latin America, you can feel this on the field, the impact of the actions, the U.S. Actions in Venezuela. Does the Venezuela case reflect a broader pattern of the U.S. exerting influence or even control over Venezuela, over such resource-rich country through different means, economic, financial, and military means?
Yes, of course. For most analysts, Venezuela isn't some freak accident. It's the latest chapter in an old book. We've had U.S. interventions since the last century, starting with Guatemala. So this is something that we have seen before. It is not a surprise, but it's the new way of influence and conquer the resources of another country that the imperialism has for our countries, for our hemisphere, for Latin America, because it's not just Venezuela. Here we're talking about Brazil, Colombia, Panama, and others with big resources like oil, gold, and other minerals.
Yeah,
So,
iron ore.
and then they have just changed. They have weaponized um, the economics of the countries instead of send troops to fight a war, which is some kind of what the CIA has done in this hemisphere since the last century, as I already said. But there's a clear pattern. Whenever a country with massive resources starts getting too cozy with the US rivals, like China or Russia, the US intervention alarm goes off. The Venezuela case slows that the US uses sanctions to make sure strategic resources stay within the Western family. It's about making sure the world's biggest oil reserves don't fuel the rise of a different superpower. We've seen this movie before. In the 89, the Panamanian invasion took the canal for the US. And then we are going back to that chapter of the history. And then we don't know what to expect for the future because, Latin America has a lot of resources that, of course, the Americans want and need.
Because you are following the developments in media in Guatemala, Mr. Guzman, can you share us the general reaction of the general public in Guatemala on the U.S.
Well,
actions in Venezuela?
the government isn't happy with it. The Guatemalan government condemned it because it's an invasion to sovereignty of a country, of a free country, and and the people are divided because, let's say, disinformation or about Venezuela and Venezuelans have been spread that they are living bad, that they had a bad situation, economics and everything, and some are happy, I must say. But most of the intellectuals, academics, and people who knows what's going on and what the U.S. imperialism means are not happy with it. Because if that happened in Venezuela, what can we wait for in the next years?
Thanks, Mr. Guzman. Professor Quelch, you are a professor of economics. Let's look at the broader picture. How might changes in Venezuela's energy sector affect global supply chains, particularly for emerging economies that depend on a stable energy market?
Venezuela, as has been pointed out, accounts for around about 17% of total oil reserves in the world. It's a very high proportion for a single country. And yet, in the last 20 to 30 years, Venezuela's daily production has significantly declined from a peak of around about 3.5 million barrels per day to a current production level of 1 million barrels per day. And this is largely a function of A, mismanagement, B, a lack of investment in maintenance and infrastructure, and C, sanctions that have been levied against Venezuela that have curtailed its freedom to export generally internationally. So the answer to your question is that given the current level of Venezuelan production per day, disruption to international markets will actually not be that great, even if this particular million barrels per day were no longer available to the market due to the current volatility. However, certain markets are likely to be affected, and in particular, the China market will see constraints in terms of the supply of heavy crude to the teapot refineries in China that nevertheless, collectively, the imports from Venezuela account only for about 3% of China's total import requirements. So even with respect to China, which is a major customer of Venezuela at the moment for its heavy crude, even China likely to be able to find alternative supplies from other sources. And I might add that the teapot refineries in China have maintained a pretty high buffer inventory of heavy crude in cargo vessels off the coast of China. So overall, I would say the current level of the level of disruption likely is relatively low.
Appreciate a reality check and the historical lesson, Professor Quelch. So you mentioned that it will be less of a disruption in the oil supply to emerging countries such as China. But are we seeing a trend towards more diversified global supply, energy supply chains and more flexible chains? We see China relying more on renewable energy, and many countries are trying to find other sources of energy. How could this affect economic prospects of developing countries, their perspective and reserve, on different kinds of energies?
So most countries do not have the benefit of significant oil reserves. So when you see this kind of political volatility that creates uncertainty in markets and potentially results in spikes in energy prices, it's a natural incentive for countries to invest in self-sufficiency, and that means investing in renewables if they have the availability of wind or solar or hydro to be able to do that. In addition, if investment funds are available, the management of the grid is a very important source of additional energy efficiencies, so that the distribution of energy that's collected by solar and wind is rendered as efficient as possible. So, overall, your hypothesis is correct that any nation would want to be as self-sufficient as it can possibly be in energy. And as I've indicated, disruptions of this nature can only fuel the desire for that self-sufficiency.
Exactly. And to Mr. Guzman, we just talked about the perspective, because you're from Guatemala, from a Latin American perspective, how these U.S. actions in your region, perceived in the region, how do your media, because you're from media, report such developments? Mr. Guzman?
No.
Sorry.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, my question is to you, because you're from a media from Guatemala in the Latin American region. How do your country's media report the U.S. actions in the region?
We just woke up with a surprise. Somebody was picked up from a country by the Americans. So now our question is, for example, Lula in Brazil or Petro in Colombia, can they think, are we the next? Because it's something that's been doing lately. The weaponizing of narco-terrorism gives the U.S. the opportunity to do what they did with Maduro. Even though if we don't like Maduro or if we like Maduro, that is a big threat to the sovereignty of our countries because they can do it everywhere now. And not only the US, probably the other superpowers can do it, uh, claiming that the narco terrorism is something that they can pursue and they will be feeling able to capture whomever, wherever, even though this is not a war declaration from anywhere. So there's a lot to talk about the Trump corollary. People are worried that Washington is officially making the territory again, telling China and Russia to stay out of their backyard. We're reading it in a microwave, because it's just a sign what the U.S. did this weekend.
So America, you just mentioned, wants to see Latin America as their backyard, but do people in Latin America like to be perceived by the U.S. that way?
Well, unfortunately, we Guatemalans have almost 4 million of Guatemalans working in the U.S., as well as the rest of Central America. Venezuelans went to the U.S. by millions, fleeing Venezuela because of the problems they had. And as well as our countries, Venezuela, Peru, Colombia, and others, they have a lot of people working in the States, which is a very different kind of conception that you can get about what's the feeling that the people from our countries have about the U.S. Because from one side, let me tell you, 30% of our PIB, or I don't know if it's the correct way to say it in English, the it's comes from the States, comes from people who works in the States. So it's a huge amount of money. For us, for example, it's like 21,000 million dollars that keep the economy working. And so it's hard to say what they think. But of course, what I really mean is that the US wants everybody to know that they are keeping their backyard now
Yeah.
with this example.
We appreciate your perspective on this. That's the fact, So many people from Latin America are working or have family members working in the United States and receive on maybe yearly or monthly basis a lot of income from them. To Professor Xu, because just now Professor Quelch mentioned that the U.S. Pressure and restrictions on Venezuela has created the decline of oil output from 3.5 million barrels a day to just 1 million barrels. That's a very significant drop. So how much do you think the U.S. impact has done that? Why the U.S. Wants to do that, wants to reduce Venezuela's oil output?
I think the sanctions and the maritime blockades have forced Venezuela's oil exports to near standstill, as you just said. And the Venezuela's national oil companies, PDVSA, used to be the backbone of the state revenue, has been severely crippled. And production capacity also, as you said, has declined sharply and remained below pre-sanction levels. So but we all know that oil revenues account for over 90% of Venezuela's foreign exchange earnings because Venezuela is definitely a petrol state, 80 to 90%. So the export disruptions will definitely lead to a sharp drop in its domestic fiscal revenues, inability to pay for, imports and debts and hyperinflation's resurgence, I think. And also, I think the US financial restrictions have also further isolated the economy from global energy financial systems. And the results, the US intentions for this results are definitely for its own interests, right? He wants President Trump wants its oil companies to jump in, right, to reassert the influence. Yeah, I think that's the main reason.
Right. Thanks for mentioning that. Professor Quelch, Professor Xu just mentioned that 80 to 90% of Venezuela's income coming from oil. And your economists look into the future. If Venezuela reaches some kind of consensus or cooperation with the U.S. and U.S. forces or U.S. economic power comes into Venezuela and maybe help it to develop, what kind of steps can Venezuela take to diversify its economy and reduce its reliance on the energy sector, just like what the Mideast has been trying to do?
Right. So let me begin by suggesting that actually the investment in the energy sector is likely to be the quickest and most productive way to re-energize the Venezuelan economy. And if investor confidence can be developed with various political guarantees that assure private investors, maybe US or other oil companies, for example, that their investments will be protected and a return will be guaranteed to their shareholders, then I think the confidence that that will develop could generate more investor interest in Venezuela, which after all has proven itself to be a very vibrant economy if we go back to the 1970s, for example, and which has a very significant and educated population, especially if you count the millions of Venezuelans living outside of the country. So who are, I think, very, very keen to help their country rebuild the economy. So I think they would be among the most likely private sector and small business investors to fuel a resurgence in Venezuela. But I think the oil sector is kind of the key. Now, let me point out that since around the year 2000, there have been something like 60 international court arbitrations against Venezuela in favor of oil companies. And these companies are owed approximately $20 billion by Venezuela. That's about 10% of Venezuela's national debt. They're owed this money, and the way in which they will be motivated to reinvest in Venezuela will depend upon the clearing of that debt through the production of oil that the revenues from which will be helping to pay off their debt and guarantee their additional investments. So my bottom line here is simply that the energy sector, whether it's oil, and we haven't mentioned natural gas as well, which is also something that Venezuela is very abundant in, and which is also hugely underleveraged in terms of current production. You know, Venezuela has the oil, it has the gas, it has nickel, it has a number of very important mineral and energy resources. The activation of those sectors will be what will, I think, fuel the redevelopment of the economy. Of course, light manufacturing, agriculture, there are a number of other areas where relatively smaller levels of investment can generate jobs, generate consumption and investment domestically, and which collectively can be significant. but I think the key is still the energy sector.
So are you suggesting that be realistic, to get to ground one first, do not vision too much, just do the first job first, that's to invest in oil, invest in minerals, do what you're good at before, adapting some so-called long-term strategies, right? It's not just
Yes,
for,
and I think that
yeah.
Yes, and I think that, as I've indicated, rebuild confidence by rebuilding what you already had. And once you rebuild what you already have shown you can do previously, that will generate confidence in investment in other sectors. But trying to reboot the economy while leaving the energy sector unattended to, that strikes me as being pie in the sky.
A pie in the sky, a very nice way to address it. Does this case apply not only to Venezuela, but also to many other Latin American countries, which are, in most cases, rich in natural resources, in minerals, in iron ore?
Every country is different, and every country is similar. But I think that the critical point here is that it depends where the country is in terms of its trajectory on the development curve, and also the investment confidence that it generates in the international environment. There are a number of cases where you can point in Latin America to Chile, you can point to Brazil. These are countries that have gone through challenging economic times, but which are currently quite strong in terms of their international investment appeal. But there are other countries in Latin America that have not fared so well. And, if they were to, for example, set up all sorts of economic zones and, talent development programs and so forth, it might go unnoticed or lacking in credibility. Whereas if you have a base of economic success, such as Chile has developed over the last couple of decades or 3 decades, you then have the momentum and the credibility to be able to do much more in terms of attracting international investment interest.
Right, very, very interesting. You're giving us an economic lesson here, Professor Quelch. So let me ask Mr. Guzman, because you're in Latin America, many Latin American countries have this, middle income trap for decades now. Do you agree with Mr. Quelch, what he's just mentioned, that be realistic, go to ground one first, build momentum and confidence in the industries that your country is good at, either it's natural resources, natural gas, oil, minerals, and do not vision too much into high-tech zones? Mr. Guzman?
Well, in my country, we're a tiny country compared to others, of course, but we export a lot of working people to the United States. And that gives us a different kind of resources that they need, because what the Guatemalans do is something that not an American wants to do. In terms of reshaping the whole world strategy of oil, gas, and resources, I think that this is the beginning of a new era, because whatever they want, whatever they need, they will be able to take it if they find a legal or even an illegal way to do it. I mean, being so close to the US, you can understand how powerful they are here in the region, because we are part of the United States, even though we don't belong to them, we do. It's a very interesting phenomena, because most of the money we have, our first client is the United States, then is Central America. But you, China, sells us 70% of the goods and things that we uh, need here to live. So even though we don't have diplomatic relationships with you, which is a shame for me,
Oh,
we do have a very good commercial relationship. And the difference between other countries is that we don't have oil, but we do have jade, we have minerals and other things, but we are not that big enough to reshape what the Latin American countries have in terms of what the U.S. would need from them, which gives us the chance to be out of that invasion or that kind of thing that happened in Venezuela, I hope.
right. Interesting. And now each country looking for their best interests is only natural. Professor Xu, we want to continue to talk about what Professor Quelch just mentioned. For a country like Venezuela, they should just be realistic and keep focusing on their best resources, that's their oil resources, and build confidence and momentum on that first. How much do you agree with Professor Quelch on that?
I think, sadly to say, I'm not very optimistic about Venezuela's future because, as we know, Venezuela has been, in the humanitarian crisis since 2014, and now we see the seizure of its own president. So a lot of things, in energy sector may be, starting to refresh, renewed again. So probably there would be two scenarios. One could be U.S. companies, as I said, jump in, take over core oil assets, and probably will gradually restore productions like Professor Quelch just said, and exports mainly directly to U.S. and its allies. But there could be some other scenario is that the interim government currently gains stability and the U.S. eases sanctions. Venezuela may rebalance relationship with China, Russia, and other countries. And so I think that could gradually adapt partial export channels, diversify partnerships in the future, I think.
So you're suggesting that there's still a lot of difficulties for Venezuela to really build up its healthy and strong and sustainable oil industry. It's still facing a lot of difficulties.
Yeah, I think unlike Brazil, unlike Argentina, Venezuela is still heavily reliant on oil, right? It's very path dependent on oil. And like other countries, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they already try to diversify, their channels of exports, right? Not just, only exporting raw materials. But Venezuela is still I think in its resource curse of the energy, dependence.
I catch that keyword, resource curse. Thank you.
Yes.
We just spent half an hour talking to three distinguished guests in our show. They're from different aspects of China, United States, and also Guatemala. We just talked to Professor Xu Yanran, Research Fellow for Center for Latin American Studies at the Renmin University of China, Mr. Ronaldo, and Rick Martinez Guzman, the founder and editor-in-chief iDocumenta in Guatemala, and Professor John Quelch, the American president of Duke Kunshan University. We talk very extensively on U.S. action in Venezuela, its ripple effect on the energy sector, and the probable future of Venezuela, a country that's heavily dependent on oil resources. I think that wraps up this edition of BizTalk. This issue, this Venezuela development will definitely go on. We'll always keep a very close watch on this issue and bring you the latest discussion on that. Thanks for watching this edition of BizTalk. I'm Junju Feng. See you again.